Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. You can follow us on YouTube. Don't worry, you won't be subjected to video of me, but you'll hear the audio portions of this program archived there. Just search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Next up for us is policy analyst for the Grover Hermann Center for the Federal Budget at the Heritage Foundation, David Ditch. David, welcome back to the program. How are you doing this morning? And man, how do you get a job, watching the federal budget? Is that all you have to do? Gosh.
Oh, that's a full-time job, and I also have to look at all the different ways the politicians are messing up on infrastructure policy. So there's a lot of bad going on here in the swamp.
You've written and taken part in this piece, how the Senate Republicans can cut $100 billion in spending right now. I think my first question is, when we're already talking about tens of trillions and multiple tens of trillions of dollars in debt, how much is $100 billion going to make an impact, aside from the fact that it's just a good idea? But how much is this going to start moving us back towards the full faith and credit of a government that actually knows what to do with its budget?
Well, they say a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, and that's what this is. The Congress, regardless of who's been in the White House, regardless of who controls the chambers, for the last 20 years has been fiscally irresponsible time and time again, because it's politically convenient to give away a bunch of goodies and without paying for it, partially because the mainstream media doesn't care and always acts as though spending is in general a good thing. They need to start taking things seriously. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing in this case is that it's not about coming up with some legislative package or a bunch of reforms and cuts and eliminations and trying to get it to pass both chambers. This isn't even that complicated. Congress just has to not act, and there's going to be this over $100 billion in savings.
How so?
So there is a rule called statutory pay-go. Mm-hmm. The bottom line of it is, when Congress increases the deficit massively through new legislation, there's what's called a scorecard. And if at the end of a session of Congress, which is going to be happening in a little over 2 months, if there is a balance, that Congress has been mischievous and has increased the deficit, they need to, there's a mechanism whereby certain types of spending will receive a haircut to help cover for some amount of the deficit increase. Most federal spending is exempt. So Social Security is exempt. National defense is exempt. Veterans benefits are exempt. Food stamps are exempt. The relatively small pile of what's left is going to get a cut that is so small that when it's happened in the past, no one noticed it.
Oh, wow. Okay. I've heard these haircuts mentioned before, and it's usually in the defense of some rhetoric-laced government shutdown looming, which we are going to see again in December. What is the concern from where you are, before we go back to how they can cut it, that the lame duck Congress, if it truly is a lame duck majority, is going to just do pretty much every spending plan they've ever thought of, dreamed of having in this lame duck session to avoid a government shutdown and try to force this spending off on a new majority in Congress coming in 2023. Is there concern about that?
No, that's another very serious problem. They essentially say that we are going, there's a lot of members who say essentially we're going to shut down the government unless we get goodies for our preferred special interests. And whether that is certain tax credits that are essentially corporate welfare, mm-hmm. whether that is quote-unquote emergency spending, much of which is in the form of slush funds that don't have anything to do with disaster response.
Right.
And like you say, with just new spending, these what are called appropriations bills, the things that, for example, fund the national defense, that fund all the federal agencies, frankly, in large part, this is the leadership in both chambers saying that you rank and file members, you have to swallow this entire thing, and if you don't like it, then we're going to shut the government down and you're the bad guys.
So is there, and considering it's middle of December, my suggestion is bite the bullet, give everyone a couple of weeks early to Christmas, and allow for the government to shut down just for those weeks until the new Congress is sworn in, and then start with something fresh. I've heard even discussions about a process that works on some of the local levels, like a zero-based budgeting, where each department would have to come in with a brand new fresh budget instead of just tacking whatever number of percentage points onto last year's spending they want to add. What are those? Do you think there's any likelihood of that, David?
There's always a possibility of things, of there being dysfunction and Congress leaving without having done what, in theory, is their jobs. On the one hand, a short-term government shutdown, I don't think is that big of a deal. You're largely inconveniencing people like federal workers, and you're obviously inconveniencing certain people here in the swamp, like lobbyists. But ultimately, the wheels are going to keep on turning for the country. But at the same time, if it drags out for too long, if it drags out for months rather than weeks, that is going to start, impacting national defense. That is going to impact things like the Social Security program. So it's not ideal. What we need to essentially have some accountability. Mm-hmm. We need to say that just because we don't want the country to go bankrupt doesn't mean that we should, have things like national defense be held hostage. And we need more people in Washington, D.C. to step up for the sake of any semblance of fiscal responsibility, mm-hmm. and start calling out the bad behavior that enables things to keep getting worse.
We've heard it from the campaign trail, David, Democrats who hear their Republican opponents calling for budget fiscal responsibility, and they point to previous Republicans and say, really? But what about? And generally it becomes an undefendable position to take that stance. It sounds like that's what you're talking about, is at some point, Republicans are going to have to be the ones to say, okay, we actually did, whether it's Rand Paul's nickel plan, or I guess it's up to a dime now, or something along your plans of even just getting this $100 billion cut.
Yes. And I will take a moment to plug our team at the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org/budget. We've produced the most comprehensive budget plan, frankly, that I've seen produced by any organization ever. We have over 200 policy proposals. And obviously, a lot of these are things that would never pass a closely divided Senate, but there needs to be some room for at least some of these things to come together in a package, whether it's getting rid of, as I've mentioned, corporate welfare through the tax code, whether it's getting rid of a lot of wasteful spending programs that are essentially slush funds for the benefit of politicians rather than the general public. There's so much potential, but we just need to get started, and we need to come in with the mindset of we're on the road to financial ruin. We could derail the economy not just for a couple of weeks or for a couple of years with a short recession. We could hobble the prosperity and growth that Americans take for granted permanently if we don't start paying attention.
So what are some of these steps that will lop off this $100 billion, fairly straightforwardly, and at least start the process, David? So
if Congress doesn't act there's a thing they call clearing or wiping clean the scorecard, where Congress essentially at the end of the session says, yeah, we know what the budget rules say, but we're just going to pretend that they don't exist and don't apply to us.
Oh, boy.
If we just don't clear the PAYGO scorecard and don't block these spending cuts from happening, they will happen automatically. And that's the beautiful thing. They don't have to pass a bill through the House and get 60 votes in the Senate to have these spending reductions take place, we only need 40 senators, or 41 senators, I should say, to do the right thing in the Senate and say, no, Americans are suffering. We've got high inflation in large part because the government is running such high deficits, pumping new money into the economy, which by definition, when you have more money chasing the same number of goods, prices are going to go up. We can get started on the right path by just letting this budget rule, which was enacted under Obama, by the way. Mm-hmm. So there's bipartisanship behind this rule. Let's just let this one relatively small budget rule go the way it's supposed to go. And then in the next session of Congress, let's roll up our sleeves and actually start making some hard decisions.
That's going to be the hard part, is the hard decisions part come the next year and getting past the December 15th brinksmanship of this continuing resolution. If I'm not mistaken, the last actual budget that the U.S. government passed before this bevy of continuing resolutions, President Obama is the one that signed it into law. It was 2010, I believe, and we've just been doing these brinksmanship moments with hair on fire rhetoric of government shutdowns and Trump shutdowns and that kind of thing. At some point, some of these agencies need to be asked, what are you spending the money on? Especially, I believe there was a report some 10 years ago about hundreds of billions of dollars in redundancies in Washington.
Yes, there's a lot of redundancy. There's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, and there are lots of ways to go after it. And again, I'm a very strong limited government conservative. Mm-hmm. I realize that there's lots of people in the country who don't have that opinion. But one thing we should be able to agree on is that the federal deficit is too high. The federal debt is too high, and that we should be trying to live within our means. And that involves going after some programs where if there are some things that are as small as a couple $100 million, which is a lot in real world terms, but is chump change in D.C. Mm-hmm. But if you go after even these small things, each one of these little programs, each one of these corporate welfare tax credits has a constituency that is very motivated to protect their little niche of the federal budget. But because these costs are spread across 300 million Americans, we don't tend to notice each individual piece. But we do notice when inflation hits 8%. We do notice when the federal debt hits $31 trillion with a T, trillion dollars, which, by the way, is rapidly approaching $250,000 in debt for every household in the country.
Good golly. So when we look at some of these redundancies, some of these programs, can we make the case and borrow from our friends on the left when they go after and they demagogue things like Social Security? Can we turn the tables on that and say, if we do these things, we'll help protect the solvency of things like Medicare, Social Security, by not having all this money disappear out the other end of the government?
Absolutely. I mean, Social Security, when I was a kid, people talked about, Social Security isn't going to be around for you probably. Well, now it's a matter of, is Social Security going to go bankrupt before most of the people who are currently on Social Security finish receiving benefits? We're talking about the next 10 to 15 years where Social Security goes bankrupt. The Medicare Trust Fund goes bankrupt in about 5 years. There are lots of people who rely on these programs. They've been promised by members of Congress and presidents from both parties that they should be able to count on these programs being there, and congressional irresponsibility, letting problems within these programs fester and accumulate and get worse and worse and worse over time is why they're in trouble. And it's also very important that members of Congress, that people like President Biden, don't demagogue necessary changes to these programs. It's not even about reducing the amount of spending in these programs. It's about having them not grow faster, 2 and 3 times faster than the economy, but rather just grow about as fast as the economy, allowing them to be sustainable.
Mm-hmm. We just had a fairly good-sized tax cut. Governor Youngkin here in Virginia sent rebates because of budget surpluses still through COVID, and sent rebates of that tax overage to the citizens and cut some taxes. And even with that, the next quarter, their collections went up. Is that, again, the reminder? You don't have to be Milton Friedman to know that if you cut government size and you cut taxes, you're going to get more economic activity, which equals more tax collections.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that is very underreported, is the extent to which the federal government, state governments, local governments are raking in money hand over fist. We think back 5 years to when the 2017 tax cut bill happened. There was lots of wailing and moaning about how this was going to bankrupt the country. But the revenue levels right now are higher than what was expected to be the case if we hadn't done the tax cuts. As it turned out, the tax cuts have helped facilitate enough economic growth to pretty much pay for themselves, which I wasn't even expecting it would be that successful. I didn't think it would pay for itself, but it has. There's more than enough money right now that the governments are bringing in to pay for all the necessary functions of government and a certain amount of programs that you or I, as limited government types, would disagree with. The problem isn't revenue. The problem is they can't stop the spending spree.
Right. It's always been that case. And actually, the revenues created by tax cuts are healthier because they've actually gone through a couple of other hands that have been involved in the commercial activity that have generated that revenue as well. So there's more health than just the health at the receiving end of the government tax collections. David Ditch, thank you so much for all of the work you and the whole team does there at the Heritage Foundation. Certainly, Steve Moore has got to get credit along with Matthew Dickerson and you for all the work you're doing on this. And I thank you for these proposals. And you can read it at heritage.org/budget. And you have a wonderful weekend. Happy Halloween.
Take care.
And thank you for joining us. And I hope your costumes scare everyone, or at least you get good treats. And if there's somebody is dressed as a government official offering you treats, slam the door in their face. Until next week, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, so long, and thanks for all the fish.